points of this presentation. And then I hope we'll go to some hands-on work here if we manage to get online. If we don't manage to get online, then we can just talk about it, because you all must have enough information that we can exchange. But I would prefer it. So my first point is that I think at this point we need to think of heritage language programs as a program, not as a program that has an outcome, not as a semester where we teach them to read and write, not as a year where we teach them to read and write in some cultural stuff, okay? But we generally think of foreign language classes in terms of outcomes, and many of us use actual proficiency guidelines to assess our students, and we'll talk about a lot. There has been some discussion in the literature about whether oral proficiency interviews are a suitable instrument for heritage language learners. There was an article by Guadalupe Valdez, whose name you must have seen already if you read anything about heritage. In '89, Guadalupe Valdez wrote that she didn't do a study, she just analyzed what she knew, which is a lot about Spanish heritage students, and she said an OPI is not the right instrument for them because they haven't learned from the textbook, and OPI has been set up in a way to assess textbookish knowledge. And since then, many people have repeated that. And I don't think that's true. It may be true to an extent, and Judy will know more about it. It may be true more in some languages than others. In Spanish, for example, with its dialects and so on, Valdez's argument was that, well, here's a student who is completely fluent in the home variety of the language. However, it's not an academic variety. So what are we doing with that student? How are we testing? That's a valid argument. However, if testers know what they're testing for, and maybe that student cannot be tested by the instrument because the academic variety is not there, and OPI basically tests for some sort of academic variety. But, it depends on how we do it. There was a study that my center co-sponsored and was done by Actual, where we tested Russian and Spanish heritage language speakers at superior level of proficiency, and I think they can be tested. And we test our Russian speakers all the time. And since we're talking about Russian, I won't stray into other languages, but I think Russian is what Fishman calls Russian is a middle-class language. Mm-hmm. What it means, it's a language mostly of educated people. We need to understand education broadly, of course. Mm-hmm. But we can say that, Korean is a similar language, Persian is a similar language, some others have more variety. So if we just talk about Russian, I do think we can use OPIs. And I also think we can measure the proficiency that heritage language learners can achieve in those terms, and that's, I think, where we need to go. We've been at this long enough to say we need outcomes. We need to know what we can offer them. We need to tell them what we can offer them. And when Anna Kudima presented yesterday, she actually gave you OPI scores for heritage. We do that all the time. All right? So that's my point number one. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Point number two is that we can use authentic materials for real-life purposes. Now, what do you understand authentic materials to be?
Materials are used for in the media for the native population within the country.
Right. So materials created by native speakers for native speakers, right? That's a very simple definition. And we all use them for the past 20 years. I believe we all use them in foreign language teaching as well. However, the tasks that we frequently designed for these materials are not real-life tasks. So we take authentic materials and use them in a non-authentic way. There may be nothing wrong with that. We're scaffolding because students need scaffolding, right? However, I believe that, and I'll talk about it, I believe that with heritage language learners, because they come out of a community and family language, we can use it differently. We can actually use authentic materials for authentic purposes, which means use them the way they were intended for their audience. And the third point that I want to make is when teaching heritage language learners, we need to be cognizant, remembering that a lot or some of what's happening with them may be relearning. We don't know what that is exactly. We don't know when relearning starts and ends, right? What starts? I argue a little bit, generally, against very rigorous placement tests for heritage learners, because you give a placement test, you see whatever it is you see, whether orally or in writing, and then you put that student into a class, and he or she may take off. And some of it may be relearning. A psychologist who used to be, educational psychologist who used to be at UCLA and is now in Hong Kong, Terry Au, talks about relearning is one of the major features of heritage language acquisition or learning. So that's something I do think would be a good idea to think about. And the other thing is incidental learning, and I'll get into that in maybe the next slide. Mm-hmm. So just on this first point, there are several studies, but among them two that use Russian, by Irene Thompson and Rifkin, that basically say that a typical foreign language graduate, the foreign language learner graduates at 1 class after 3 or 4 years of language study. And we all know that if our students graduate at 1 class, we think, oh,
good speaker.
Intermediate high, right? Well, I'm using the ILR, right? But you're familiar with that. Okay. So actual numbers, ratings go novice, intermediate, advanced, superior, distinguished, and ILR go 0, 1, 1 plus, 2, 2 plus, 3, 3 plus, 4, 5. Yes. So that's what I want you to think about when Judy talks to you, when you analyze the guidelines and all. So this is what we have with foreign language learners. We are proud of our students and ourselves, graduating them at intermediate high, and just deliriously happy if they graduate at advanced. And it almost doesn't happen, right? And at the same time, a typical heritage language learner starts at intermediate. Some of them, without literacy, start at advanced. Okay? So what do we do then? 2 years later, they're still at intermediate, they're still at advanced. Because we spend a lot of our time teaching them how to spell. So, that's something that I would like you to think about, particularly when you're working on the modules. It would be terrific if you prepared modules that teach them spelling and grammar and all of that, but think about why you are doing it and what we want to achieve. Of course, with modules, it's terrific because then everyone could go to their own, module. Nevertheless, if your modules stay at this level of intermediate proficiency, which is a broad range of proficiency, we are not getting anywhere. We need to get them up. So at least that's my personal opinion, and that's what we are doing now at UCLA. We try no longer to think, oh, we'll just teach them a little bit. We tell them what we hope they can achieve. Okay, so that's pretty much what I want to say about proficiencies. And now I will talk about incidental learning and explain what it is, and also about real life verbs. Okay. So from the survey that I described yesterday, it was a survey done at UCLA in 07-09 when we collected 1,800 responses from heritage language learners of 22 languages, and 200 among them were Russian. We could produce this. This shows what students, heritage language learners who are in our classrooms, do outside of the classroom, not controlled by us, just in their real life, okay? And they do various things. They attend community events, some read newspapers, some read, actually, visit a website. Lots of them speak on the phone. Everyone speaks on the phone. And I know that one time when I was presenting to a Vietnamese group of Vietnamese teachers, and I said this, they laughed, and they said, oh yes, they call us, and they say, hello, Mom, and then the rest of it I speak in Vietnamese, and my kid says, Nevertheless, they do call, they do get input, and even if that input is code mixed, when I said code mixed, do you know what I mean? No. All right. That means they mix English and their home language. So what Anna called yesterday Russlish. And that's not a derogatory term. And don't take it as a derogatory term. It's the reality of a language in contact. And people use it differently. People react to it violently, saying, oh, if you are spoiling the language. That's not the case. The case is that we live with other languages. And that's a very common feature. You mix languages. Some people do it less, some people do it more. When you teach your students, you of course want to teach them not to do it. However, I know some Spanish teachers who feel that they need to allow some code mixing even in the classroom because that's the reality of the community. Okay? And you can teach them how to code mix so that it sounds educated. For example, you could say, as we say in English, so in Tolstoy sort of code mixing, where you throw in French, So things can be done. It's not, so the main thing is, I think, for us as teachers, not to regard that as negative. So in any case, so that was an aside, I think, but in any case, so we look at these activities that they've deformed in the language outside of class without our concern, without our supervision. And by looking at this, we know that they keep using the language. They keep getting some input and possibly also giving some output. It's very interesting to see what exactly happens, and if anyone is interested in research of natural data, getting natural data would be fantastic. We don't have so much of it yet. But, and also just to mention that depending on the language, these are different. For example, attended a community or church event is not typical for Russian, okay? As we can guess easily. Speaking on the phone is typical for everyone. Listening to music is very typical for everyone. And then it depends. Watching TV, yes. Watching it with their parents, with grandparents, very typical. So there is a lot they do outside of class. And then they come to class and we teach them in a way that goes sort of against the grain of how they acquired language at home. So that's why I'm talking about thinking of teaching for real-life purposes. And what are real-life purposes? There is interviewing, which can be used potentially for research, or just everyone likes to interview. It's a really interesting exercise. You learn about other people. So you can do that. And as I talked about it yesterday, a lot goes into the interviewing. We need to teach pragmatics. We need to explain about the cultural background. So lots and lots of things. Then translating. With the communicative methodology, we started thinking of translation as something we don't need because as a reaction to the grammar translation method. However, translating and translation is a really fantastic useful real-life task and also an excellent exercise. I still think that the best way to teach reading in Russian is have students translate, because if they don't, they guess at the meaning, and they never learn the Russian word order. It's only when they start translating, when they understand they have to look at the back for the subject. Okay? You can do it differently. I'm not saying that's the only way, but there is nothing wrong with that. For heritage language learners, it's a very good exercise because that gives them a hold on what they can do and take their learning further, right? It also gives them an idea of how they could possibly use their language in real-life situations. Interpreting is a big field. It's a difficult kind of thing. So I'm not saying that's what we need to teach. Very few programs in this country even have programs for interpreting. However, there is research that shows that heritage language learners serve as language brokers, right? Which means that when they are 9 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old, they interpret for their parents who don't know the language. So they go with their parents to a doctor, to a store, to social services, to wherever. And they help their parents navigate the communication. Okay? So they do that. So that is a good real-life exercise for our students. Here is someone who doesn't know any English, Russian. Let's play with that. Or you read this text in English, could you explain to someone what it is in Russian? You read this text in Russian, could you explain to someone what this text is in English? This is building real-life tasks into the curriculum. All right, then communicating in writing, that was mentioned yesterday, and I think we absolutely need to teach communicating in writing. The question is whether we need always to think of writing as essay writing. And I would say no. I think actually even for foreign language learners we don't need to. But I'm not talking about that. So for heritage, we do need to teach them. I think, and then again, it may be important, Marina, for your units. Real life tasks, and real life task is, well, I just said emailing and blogging, right? What else would be real life tasks in writing? Texting,
Facebook, social media,
things like those. All right? Okay. And then reading. I think reading is vital, and they need to read in a variety of genres. And they need to be able to interpret the text. Interpret means understand. I don't mean interpreting in the literary theory sense of, but understand. To understand the text, they need to have some background. So we need to tie in text with the background information. And this underlies everything else, acquiring cultural literacy. Sometimes people ask, well, in blogs and forum and social media, Russians use this awful language. They code mix. They use English words. They use English words transliterated. We shouldn't allow our students to see that. Well, we don't have control of our students' life. Well, I'm happy, actually, we don't have control of our students' lives. So, do we tell them not to go and use those sources? We cannot do that. They will go anyway if they're interested. But we could use them for the curriculum to our own advantage. Okay? And if Russians use their media in this way, if they blog in a mix, who are we to tell them not to do it? All right? So we're going back to Peter the Great and Slavophils, who said, what is it in Pushkin? Shishkov, прости, не знаю, как перевести. It's because Shishkov was so fond of real Russian language, and he lost out, right? We'll lose out, too, if we try to enforce the same standards. So in any case, so these are real life purposes, and I'm sure you can come up with another 40 of those, and that's what I hope you'll do. All right, now to the next point, which is two kinds of learning, purposeful learning and incidental. Purposeful learning is what we do in the classroom. You know, you come to a classroom and you have a purpose, and the teacher knows what he or she's teaching, and you know what it is you're supposed to learn. Incidental learning is something you go outside and you hear something and you remember it. Okay? You don't remember everything, but then with purposeful learning, classroom learning, you don't remember everything either, right? So heritage language learners grew up in the home, and their language, all of their language, comes to them incidentally. That's why they don't know the grammar. You know, it's a naturalistic acquisition of the language. They don't know the grammar. They don't need the grammar. They can speak and they can understand. They cannot speak so well, right? But they can understand, which means they have this internal grammar. So what do we do with that? When they're in the classroom, we generally just try to teach them in a very linear, purposefully motivated way. And then we say, oh, my foreign language, I've heard that, so it's a quote, my foreign language learners are doing better than my heritage language learners in class. And the question is, doing better at what? And then the next question is, doing better, why? And that's the question we need to answer if we want to teach them well. And that's the question you will have to answer, Marina, also for your modules. All right? Because the question is, what's the purpose? And maybe also when they walk into the classroom and we immediately start breaking down the Russian grammar into little pieces and spelling in little pieces, it goes totally against the grain of everything they've learned. You know, it's not easy for 6-year-olds to learn Russian grammar in the classroom, but they're 6-year-olds and they take 10 years or 12 years. Here we take grown-ups. You know, they have some idea of the language. It's wrong. They don't have meta-language to describe it. They don't know what it is they know, right? But it doesn't mean they don't know it. So how do we approach it in a way that they would feel that their language is validated and at the same time they're learning? So possibly, I think, with a lot of reading, they may learn incidentally. But we also need some purposeful learning. I wouldn't say that you only need to, you know, if we just use incidental learning, it wouldn't be bad. But we probably need more time, and also you can't measure it. And since we are all academics, we need to measure and give grades, right? So it's possible actually to use incidental learning and then assign grades, but we need to rethink what we do. But I would say both are valuable and both probably are critical to success, especially because, so this is just what is incidental learning, but it's unintentional, unplanned learning, right? But then there are some disadvantages of non-planned learning because it may not be effective. But then do we know that our classroom teaching is always effective? No, we don't know that. If students do well on a test, it does not mean we are effective. It just means we're effective in the short term. Mm-hmm. Okay? And what we see with heritage language learners, I've seen that someone who does very well in class, okay, then comes to talk to and uses correct Russian in class, you know, and we're all very happy. And then that student comes to talk to me after class, and I hear ichni again and whatever other, you know. That's life. So he managed to keep it in mind for the class, but he still hasn't learned it, right? So it would take much longer to do it, and we need to understand that. So I do think we need to combine both, but I think if we only have a very narrow curriculum for them, I don't think it will be successful. All right, so where do we go now? So the question, why would incidental learning be useful for heritage language learners, I think is self-evident, right? How can we incorporate in teaching is less self-evident. And how can you incorporate real-life tasks in online modules and teaching in general? And that's what I'll try to talk about now, and that's what I hope can all work on. And I have more time, so I'm very happy to. All right. So we talked about authentic materials, and Mila said authentic materials is something created by native speakers for native speakers. And the question is whether when we use authentic materials, we use authentic tasks, right? And I will repeat that I would argue that with heritage language learners, it may be a good idea to think of authentic tasks. So the way a native speaker would approach that text, maybe with a little bit of scaffolding, but basically in that way.